Well, a very warm welcome, everyone, to Birmingham Cathedral for our annual Gore Lecture on Christian social theology. It's very good to have you all here, both those who are in the Cathedral and also everybody who's watching on the live stream as well. You are all very welcome. My name's Canon Andy, and it's a joy to welcome you on behalf of the Cathedral. A couple of bits of housekeeping before we start and before I introduce Ayla. If you are watching online, we'd love to hear your questions and for you to be involved in that way. You can submit them by email at questions@birminghamcathedral.com, questions@birminghamcathedral.com. If you're in the cathedral, you stick your hand up at that point. The email address is on the YouTube and Facebook introductory screen, so you can see that there, and I'll repeat it a bit later. For those of you who are in the cathedral, we're not expecting a fire alarm test. So if the fire alarm goes off, please leave by either those doors over that way or these doors here. It's where I look like a flight attendant, and make your way out to the Burnaby Monument, which is a great obelisk out in Cathedral Square over on that side. If you need the toilets, they're through that door over there by where the tea and coffee was. We're probably going to have about an hour or so of lecture from Ayla, and then about half an hour or so for questions and discussion. And I promise that we will finish promptly at 9 o'clock, so you can go off then. So it's my enormous pleasure this evening to welcome as our speaker tonight the Reverend Dr. Ayla Lepine. It's wonderful to have you with us, Associate Rector at St James Piccadilly, and someone who combines a great and deep knowledge of art and art history with a focus on belonging, beauty and social justice, which we're really looking forward to hearing some of the fruits of those. As you will see, our 4 great Burne-Jones windows are undergoing restoration at the moment. There's still time for you to book a free scaffolding tour if you've not already done that. And this has been a huge opportunity for us to reflect deeply on the windows and also our vocation as an urban cathedral. So I'm really looking forward to having Ayla expanding our thinking on this, and especially on sacred art's capacity to change the world for the better. So thank you, Ayla.
Thank you so much to Andy and to everyone here at Birmingham Cathedral for the invitation to be part of this Gore Lecture series and to be able to share with you something of the profound character of the way in which the Victorian artist Edward Burne-Jones engaged not only with paint and drawing and indeed in this place and many other places around the world, the medium of stained glass, but with God. And I have an apology to make. This is how I'm going to begin. It's an apology that I make on behalf of all art historians for ruining a lot of art. Not all art, we're just not that powerful, but ruining a lot of art for people. As an art historian as well as a priest, one of the things that I noticed when I began to train as an art historian in a variety of places and to learn more about the traditions of art history as a discipline, whether someone might be looking at 5th century mosaics or 18th century watercolors or anything in between from all kinds of different parts of the world, but particularly the Western European tradition, which is the area that I know the most about and where I was trained, thinking through the way that feminism and queer theory and intersectionality around racial justice can make a difference in the way that we see, imagine, interpret, understand, and make works of art. All that said, my apology is that art historians are really good at forgetting all about religion. We're superb at it. I have watched many a wonderful colleague, truly brilliant, look at a painting of Jesus or the Blessed Virgin Mary, or perhaps an abstract painting that has great theological potential, and say next to nothing about theology, or perhaps about the significance of it as an altarpiece in its first life before it ends up in a gallery or what have you. There are so many different ways to look at art. All of them are good, and all of them are precious. There is no one way. And so this evening, I'm going to be telling you a little bit about Edward Burne-Jones in relation to his biography, but not too much. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about his windows here in Birmingham, and if you have not booked your scaffolding tour, you have to do it, because I did it today, and it was honestly life-changing. It was so beautiful. I was quite calm. I went up in my hard hat and my high vis, and I sort of looked at things, and I took some photos, and I made some ooh-ah noises. But internally, I was absolutely bursting apart with joy. So you saw the sort of Canadian version of internal joy bursting apart, which was just me being very calm with my iPhone taking photos. It is a really wild thing to be up close to a work of art of this quality and of this significance in this place and at this time. It is also, as I mentioned to you earlier, transgressive. It is subversive to get up onto the scaffold and to take that tour. And the reason why I say that is that the glass is not meant to be seen by someone who is standing on some scaffolding right next to it this far away. It's not the way it's meant to be done unless you're installing it or conserving it or cleaning it or researching it. And so you are being given, each of you, a remarkable opportunity to do something that should not be happening and that should not be possible, and yet is happening and is possible because of the care that Birmingham Cathedral has put together with many other organizations and individuals like yourselves to restoring these windows so that they can be enjoyed for many, many generations. So it's not just good stewardship, it's also, in terms of the subversive enjoyment of such things, what I and my colleagues sometimes call good trouble. That you can go and you can do something surprising that you might never have imagined, and something that Burne-Jones himself would have been very surprised by, that in 2023 there are people like you and me in hard hats traipsing around and looking at his details. And one of the details which I particularly enjoyed is that in the crucifixion, which is an extraordinary image of great power and of profound symbolic intensity, done in a way that only Burne-Jones could have done it in the late 19th century. Jesus, as is often the case in Western European art, is wearing a loincloth, and the pattern of that loincloth is very similar to a William Morris pattern that people could purchase for wallpaper or for textiles. So make of that what you will, that this is a sort of multi-use thing. And that these sorts of patterns, to be serious for a moment, turn up with these Victorian artists, architects, and designers in all kinds of ways. Nothing is only ever just one thing. It's never just fixed. Something that can look beautiful on a wall, or on a bedspread, or in the background of a painting, can also find itself being put to use as something that is none other than the loincloth of Christ at the crucifixion. That is an extraordinary thing. And it's something that the Victorians did particularly well, and so they too sometimes get a bit of a bad reputation for being dusty and boring and conservative, but they are not. They are, each of them, in every case, extraordinary revolutionaries in their own right. It's just that they speak a kind of revolutionary language which sometimes we may find hard to hear, or we may not see the same things in now. I'd like also to acknowledge a couple of people, because no one ever does stuff on their own in the interconnected way that life is lived and that researchers tend to work and think. And so I'm particularly grateful to people, some of whom I mentioned by name through my talk as well, and a couple of whom I might not. One of them is Elizabeth Pretjohn, who is a fantastic Pre-Raphaelite scholar, so if you want to know about the Pre-Raphaelites, her. Tim Berenger, same thing. Catherine Hintzman, who recently wrote a whole PhD about Edward Burne-Jones and theology. I was one of her external examiners, and it was brilliant. Janet Williams, Colette Crossman, who's also done some very fine work on Burne-Jones and Christianity, so please do take a look at her work as well. And also someone named Caroline Arscott, who was also my PhD supervisor at the Courtauld Institute of Art. And she wrote a book called Interlacings about the relationship between William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones, and the relationship between socialism and community transformation and art making, and the way that things like patterns as well as philosophical concepts come into play in the bond of that friendship over many decades and the things that were produced through that friendship. And in that book, there is an amazing chapter about these stained glass windows. And without that book and without that chapter, I definitely wouldn't be saying a lot of the things that I'm going to be sharing. So acknowledging those people feels really important to me. I'm going to try to use this thing and not break it. Oh. Oh. No. Is it because of this? Huh. This is one of those moments where, you know, like I held it in my hand 15 minutes ago and it was fine, and I hold it in my hand now and it matters and it's not fine.
Small technical hitch. Harriet is coming.
There we go. Hold on. Oh! It's okay. It's okay. I'm sorry. I'm just making you run for no reason. I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, and this thing is also super sensitive. Hopefully I'll get better at this as I go along, or else this is going to be a really torturous 45 minutes. I'm going to get better at this, I promise you. So this is just briefly to familiarize you with the windows that many of you already know and love. So these are the Birmingham windows. On the left, the Nativity. On the right, the crucifixion, which I was just speaking about. And if you notice compositionally, Burne-Jones does a lot of really amazing things that are deceptively simple in order to encourage our eyes to travel. And there are lots of different things I could share with you about the composition and about the way it works, but simple enough to just look for the way that he uses blues and reds to guide your eye. The relationship between the vertical and the horizontal is not only delineated, pulled apart, and separated through the use of those very strong, simple, bold colors, but it also allows these amazing little cracking lines of the leading to come through. The leading itself, which was designed primarily by Henry Dearle, who was a close companion of Burne-Jones and William Morris, he worked with them a lot, especially towards the end of the 19th century, that's art too. The way that leading works in stained glass, it depends on the period and on the type of glass that you're looking at. Here, some of the leading is absolutely necessary, otherwise you'll have massive great sheets of glass and they won't be stable in their windows. But here, it's really like drawing, but with lead outlines. And so there's something that is being given its own energy by the way that there are those funny little partitions, those mark makings with lead, which makes it look almost like a mosaic. He's making glass behave as though it were like a mosaic. And what I particularly adore about these two pictures in particular is the way that there is this cave for the Nativity down in the bottom there, and that the way that just above that with the angels and the shepherds and the sheep, it's as though we have two completely different spaces that have just been connected to one another. But actually, because they're there in the same window and they share the same space, there's this really strange sense of community between them, as though the arc of the cave is also behaving like a kind of bridge, even as it also sort of echoes the arc of the window as a whole, and the way that that relates as a whole to the arches that we see all around us. The way that things are pulled together in these pictures such that they appear to be separate and are also part of a whole system, a whole community together, is unique. This is something that in some ways other artists do, but in others is really very specifically related to and unique to what Burne-Jones does with stained glass. And here, the Ascension and the Last Judgment. I think some of the most exciting use of glass and those little lead lines I was telling you about take place in the Ascension scene that I got a chance to look at up close today as well, so please do so if you wish. And it's in the middle, I haven't got a little laser pointer, but in the middle between Christ raising his arm in a blessing, surrounded by angels in this heavenly realm, and down below with the apostles looking up towards heaven, marveling at what they see, that there's this layer that almost looks like what happens when rain falls into puddles. like these glassy jeweled lily pads that exists between them, and the almost sort of wild permeability of that layer. It's completely solid and it's completely liquid. It's saying something about heaven and earth, about air and glass, all at the same time. And as far as the Last Judgment is concerned, I would really like Burne-Jones to speak for himself. But first I'd like to say a little bit about Edward Burne-Jones and religion. He grew up in a fairly nondescript evangelical kind of way, and he discovered Anglo-Catholicism in Oxford in the early 1850s. He and William Morris met there at Exeter College in Oxford. They went through a pretty intense phase of wondering whether or not the church and perhaps even priesthood would be where they wanted to go, and then they realized quite quickly that actually that really wasn't what it was about. What they were loving was the deep story of Christianity and the intensity of the art, the architecture, the poetry, the ritual, the music, and they became very excited about what the potential was for transformations in Christianity through those things, and they wanted to become part of that as best they could. And Burne-Jones was also really inspired by and very influenced by John Henry Newman, who by this time had converted to Catholicism. That had happened in 1845. And Burne-Jones said that Newman taught him so much. And he said that the things that Newman taught him will never be out of me. That's what he said. So there he is as someone in his late teens, his early 20s. He starts absorbing the theology of this person who is very focused indeed on a deep personal relationship with the sacraments and with Christ and with the layers of Christian history, a deep inner soul searching of conscience, the kind of writing that Newman crafts, which I'm sure many of you have read, that comes out of a really core sense of almost emotional vulnerability combined with high-key intellectual ideas. It had a huge impact on Burne-Jones. Newman gave him things that will, as he says, never be out of me. So it's very interesting exploring Burne-Jones's work through that lens, as Catherine Hintzman, who I just mentioned, has done. In 1893, Edward Burne-Jones wrote to someone and said this about his summer holidays. "A van has come out on the green opposite my home, and all over it is printed in enormous letters, 'The Luther Protest Van, established to maintain a Protestant character in the Church of England. And it has made me quite sick and undone all the good that the sea winds had been doing.'" Burne-Jones has this really fascinating relationship to religion, and I think a lot of the time he is Christianity's critical friend. He once called the Bible a great heap of antiquity. He saw it in a way not dissimilar to Chaucer, to the Arthurian legends. They were part of the raw, beautiful materials out of which art can be made, through which beauty could be explored, and in which people who would read it and consider it and weave it into their lives in all sorts of different ways would find themselves while also being connected to deeper layers of heritage and to the prospect of the great beyond, something spiritual which was impossible to put one's finger on all at once. And when he was coming towards the end of his life, he arrived at a view about what he thought was going to happen at the Last Judgment. This was around the time of this window. And he said that there were going to be two questions that would be asked of all of us. And the first question is, why didn't you? And the second question is, why did you? As this lecture series considers the relationship between theology and society and the way in which society and justice always need to be held together, and that justice seeking because of God as the ground of our being is something that we are built for, in a way not dissimilar to being built for love, I really want us to take hold of Burne-Jones's imagined questions, which will echo out, cascading through us all at the Last Judgment. Why didn't you? Why did you? Georgiana Burne-Jones, to whom he was married, said this about Burne-Jones and religion. On the subject of religious experience or of his religious faith, he was silent. and even shocked by what he thought to be any opinion too rigidly or confidently expressed by others. Once I heard him quote, she says, with approval, the saying of a Samoan chief to a missionary who was pressing him hard as to his concepts of a deity, "We know that at night someone goes by amongst the trees, but we never speak of it." Burne-Jones really loved this idea that there was a someone, a something, a someone with a capital S and a capital O, and that was enough. The kaleidoscopic fragmentation, as well as the rich composition of these windows, so simple, it's really just two things divided into four things vertically. This really is like the most simple composition. It's not tricky at all. And yet, it has an enormous array of detail and subtlety in it. And one of the ways in which Burne-Jones chooses to do that connects, I think, to what the arts and crafts designer Henry Wilson has to say about Burne-Jones's late work. He says this: "We feel the existence of an organic relation between the form and the space it occupies, that the figures have some vital connection with each other, that there is some hidden proportion between them and the boundaries of the enclosing panel." In other words, we could put it like this, that Burne-Jones really knew what he was doing when it came to color and geometry and line and form. He was a good artist. He also seems to have known what he was doing when it comes to depicting or somehow visually describing community. And that can be surprising. That wouldn't be everybody's take on Burne-Jones, partly because one of the classic characterizations, and people are not wrong about Burne-Jones about this at all, is that everyone in a Burne-Jones painting, or indeed in some Burne-Jones stained glass like this, looks a bit vacant, slightly sad, sort of languid, like they're really kind of only slightly emotionally engaged, very difficult to read psychologically. I remember talking to a colleague once who does not like Victorian art and who's not a specialist in it at all. She's interested in Rubens, where, emotionally things happen and they look completely different. And she said, yeah, the thing about Burne-Jones is that it's like 20 angels and all of them are going, "Did I leave the gas on?" There's also something really fascinating that Burne-Jones does with gender. Androgyny abounds in ways that I think are really exciting and really quite porous and curious. There are wonderful ways to read Burne-Jones queerly, and I think we should. What is the queer community of heaven? Perhaps we can start by exploring the way that Burne-Jones depicts angels in these windows. It would be a great idea. You could do another talk about the queer community of heaven and look at the windows. That'll be someone else's talk another time, but I do hope that it happens. And Burne-Jones, I think, also really felt the weight of responsibility as an artist in society, trying to make things where he knew that people would see them and that it would probably have an impact on them, for good or for ill. And it didn't necessarily mean that he wanted to make things that people liked because they would be pretty. He wanted to make things that had deep meaning. And he said this: "I was thinking about an awful thought that John Ruskin had, who's a 19th century art critic and writer and artist. And the awful thought that artists paint God for the world. There's a lump of greasy pigment at the end of Michelangelo's hog bristle brush, and by the time it has been laid on the stucco, there is something there that all men with eyes recognize as divine. Think of what that means. It is the power of bringing God into the world, making God manifest. It is giving back her child that was crucified to Our Lady of Sorrows." So that's Burne-Jones trying to fathom what it might mean to have the responsibility of an artist for whom there is a sense that an artist can in some way, if not paint the divine, which is always going to be a failure. You can't paint God, doesn't make sense. You can't even really paint Jesus, it doesn't make sense. You can give it a go, but it's inevitably a failure. which I think is a really freeing, wonderful thing. You can try, you can strive, but that the goal and the hope for art, especially art with sacred themes, is to somehow capture something of the divine, and all you have is some oil paint and your brush made out of some animal hair and people's expectations all over the place. And when he thinks about religion, the idea of doing your best comes into it for him a lot. And so here's what he says about that. Make the most of your best. This is common sense and morals. Make the most of your best for the sake of others. That is the Catholic faith, which, except a man believe faithfully, he cannot be saved. Of course, you can translate it into any religious language you please. Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, or whatnot. Have you faith? I suppose that means the same thing. I don't admit this often, but I'm going to, because even though I don't know you, I trust you, which is probably foolish, but you seem nice. So I'm going to say something which I wouldn't say to everyone, and also this is being recorded, so pray for me. And now I've made a big deal of it, so you kind of wonder what it is, and it's probably not a big deal, and many of you might like her too, I don't know. I'm a big Brené Brown fan. People know who Brené Brown is? Yeah, some people do. Great. Oh, I love that I'm getting someone being like, good for you, enthusiastic thumbs up. That's so great. So she is an American social scientist, and she's an expert on vulnerability and shame. And she is like massive New York Times bestseller, that kind of thing. And one of the things that I really enjoyed hearing from her, but was also very difficult to hear, is when she said a little while ago that she was getting incredibly irritated by people around her doing things that she found incredibly frustrating. And I'm sure that's never happened to you, and it certainly never happened to me. And she said, I'm just getting so incredibly irritated. And she said that she had to slow down and remember with great frustration that for the vast majority of the time, for the vast majority of humanity, everyone is doing their best all of the time. Which is obviously terrible, because then you think of the person next to you who just really irritated you, and you think, that's your best. That's seriously your best. It's your best. And I think that's what Burne-Jones is getting at here. Make the most of your best for the sake of others. It's a community thing. So as an artist, this is what he's given you. Make the most of your best for the sake of others. And so I'd like to give you one more chunky Burne-Jones quotation, and it is about judgment and the day of judgment. The day of judgment is a synonym for the present moment. It is eternally going on. The dies irae illa is everlastingly dissolving the ages into ashes everywhere. It is nature herself, not past or future, but the eternal being, born the sum of things are, the sum of things as they are, not as they have been or will be. What I am driving at is this. We are a living part, however small, of things as they are. If we believe that things as they are can be made better than they are, and that in faith set to work to help the betterment to the best of our ability, however limited we are, and cannot help being children of the kingdom, it is then things as they are that is the touchstone. That's the trial, the day of judgment. How do things as they are strike you? The question is bald as an egg. But it is the egg out of which every blessedness or unblessedness is everlastingly hatched for every living soul. And Caroline Arscott, who I mentioned earlier, when she writes about this work and when she writes about Burne-Jones and his understanding of judgment, she says, if the last judgment is with us always, it is because nature is continuously destroying and rebuilding life. Annihilation and regeneration are not reserved for the final day, but are part of dying, living, decay, and growth. And sometimes it's when we cling too tightly to life that we begin to realize that what we have been clinging to is not life as such, but an idol, a kind of fantasy of what we imagined must be clung to, lest it go in a direction that could be too frightening or could leave us with a loss or a lack of control. And that comes out sometimes in Burne-Jones's work as well, in the sorts of things he chooses to paint, as well as how he paints them. And I have a couple of examples for you later on. I think what happens is that this thing kind of like goes to sleep, maybe? No. Do you want to get some exercise? Yeah, this is what it does. It goes to sleep, and just as you get here, I think that's it. Yes, it's fine. Sorry. I'm not messing with you, I swear, I'm not. I think I know now that basically if we leave it alone for a while, I just have to be patient with it. I'm just going to be patient, which means that you have to be patient too. So, Morris and Company windows, Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company, of which Edward Burne-Jones is a part, that gets going in the very early 1860s. As I said before, William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones, they meet in Oxford in the early 1850s. They decide immediately that the arts are important to them, and then the rest of it they just work out as they go along. Morris figures out that he wants to be a painter, and then he figures out quite quickly that he's not very good at painting, but he is good at everything else. He can do pretty much everything else. And Burne-Jones figures out that he wants to be a painter, and that's good news because he's a painter and he's really good at it. So between both of them, they're able to pull together a huge group of people around them who produce work that comes from this idea as well of socialism, of communality, art in action, if you like. And one of the great ironies of this, of course, is that a lot of the commissions that they get are very wealthy patrons driving them. So whether it's an individual or in some cases like this one, it's a church connected to a wealthy individual. This is Holy Trinity, Sloane Square in London, with one of the biggest Morris and Company stained glass windows in existence. Has any of you been to this church before near Sloane Square? It's called brilliant, it's amazing. It's called the Cathedral of the Arts and Crafts Movement by John Betjeman. It's got some wonderful things in it, including this. And it's open every day. So if you have a chance to go, please do go and see it. And I'm showing you this image too, the cover of Jeremy Morris's recent book, A People's Church, which is a very fine one-volume history of the Church of England. So if you're wondering about how we got here and what Anglicanism is about and why the Church of England is how it is and does what it does, this is a really excellent book to go for. And the reason why I'm showing it is that its image that they've chosen for the cover is a close-up of a Morris and Company window, because there's such an identification between the aesthetic of Morris and Company and the aesthetic of the Church of England itself. Oh, there we go. And I want briefly to take us also to see some Morris and Burne-Jones stained glass, not too far from here. This is Cambridge. So on the left, a detail from a much larger window, one of the windows which was part of the 4 evangelist stained glass schemes in Jesus College Chapel. And I wanted to show you this because it also gives you a sense of how different Burne-Jones can be when working with something like the Nativity. Because earlier, the image that I showed you of the window here, which is just up there, shows a very different kind of moment where there's this sort of, the baby's almost kind of left alone. There's an enormous amount of space around this infant. There's the cave in the background, which is part of the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Here we haven't got that at all. It's much more intimate. And if you look at Joseph, how is he feeling? And images of Joseph in Western Christianity are absolutely fascinating. I think that sometimes we don't pay enough attention to the kind of masculinity that Joseph offers us, because Joseph, I think in a way which is very healthy and positive, offers us a de-centered masculinity. It is not all about Joseph. And that's because it's all about Jesus, which is great. And I remember being in the National Gallery. I had a previous role there, and I was looking with some children at an image of the rest on the flight into Egypt. And so there's this image of the Virgin Mary and Christ, and she's breastfeeding him, and Joseph is asleep in the back. He's absolutely exhausted, and he's sleeping. And this kid looks at me and says, "When do you think they sat down and said, 'He's not your real dad'?" And so this is an older man who is perplexed and who is overcome with wonder and who I think, at least to my mind in this image, has no idea what to do, which I think is really positive. It's difficult, and it's also the truth. How often does any of us, as a parent or otherwise, know what to do? And I'm also showing you here on the right, in the same chapel, kind of just around the corner, Morris and Company 1870s glass with the 9 orders of angels, as well as a series of saints, local saints and otherwise. So Bishop Alcock, who's one of the founders of Jesus College, is there, Adam. And so here you get something very, very different from what you have here in Birmingham, where you have a single figure in each of the glass forms and each of the lights. And that creates a very different sort of experience of almost having a grid. Here, you don't really have a grid. You have these partitions, but they work in a completely different way. But one of the things that gives energy and character to windows from this period by Burne-Jones is that they have a real sense of dynamism that presses out against the edges of the grid, whatever frame is being imposed. The characters and the decoration, the detail, will always try to press out, which is a really wonderful thing once you start looking for it, and it really happens here, especially in your Last Judgment window down there. I wanted to say a little bit, too, about the Pre-Raphaelites. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood is founded in 1848, and the key figures in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood are William Holman Hunt, who's Light of the World. This is the original version, which is in Keble College in Oxford. John Everett Millay, this is Christ in the House of His Parents, here on the left. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who we'll meet in just a second, and a couple of others. And there's been an enormous amount written about the Pre-Raphaelites and that early core, and so I'm not going to spend hours and hours talking to you about the Pre-Raphaelites. The purpose of me showing you this now is that William Holman Hunt and John Everett Millay, they're just a little bit older than Burne-Jones and Morris. And so when Burne-Jones and Morris are going to university and they have those moments of being like early adulthood, what are we going to do with our lives? Ruskin is the person that they're reading, and these are the paintings that are on the walls of the Royal Academy and making people get very excited and very excitable. They're very Marmite as a group, and as pictures, they're very Marmite too. People either love them or they really, really hate them. They really hate them. And one of my favorite critics of the Pre-Raphaelites, quite early on when they start exhibiting, says that looking at a Pre-Raphaelite picture is like looking at something and not having any eyelids. There's something so shocking about the colors, about the insistence upon the detail, certain kinds of gestures, and to just sort of point this out in one small way, that people thought, and Charles Dickens especially, and that's a whole other story, he wrote this big, long thing about this painting of Christ in the House of His Parents on the right. People thought that it was scandalous because the Virgin Mary and Jesus are not idealized. People thought that they looked quite ugly as human beings, and that's not what you're meant to do. That's not what Raphael and Michelangelo do with the Holy Family, with these figures. And so they're asking an important question, which I think all of us should be asking now as well, which is, what do these holy people, what does the Son of God look like? What are our conventions around that, and why? And the Light of the World, its third and final version, which is now in St. Paul's Cathedral, absolutely massive, much bigger than the first two. Millions of people flocked to see this picture, and it traveled all over the empire. And so it too became this kind of image of a certain kind of Anglicanism and a certain sort of art. On the left, Ford Madox Brown, also associated with the Pre-Raphaelite, slightly older artist, and the way that he works with the idea of gender and masculinity in this image of Jesus washing Peter's feet. The way that he works with emotion. Peter is ashamed in this painting. He's horrified. Being able to paint shame is not a particularly easy thing to do, and it's something that Ford Madox Brown has chosen to place front and center here. On the right, Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Ecce Ancilla Domini, where here too, this is a very unusual kind of annunciation. And one of the things that's quite special about this is that in the foreground, there is an embroidery on red cloth of a lily. And there are loads of different directions to go with this, but one is that there is a tradition that some of you may know, that the Virgin Mary, when she was growing up, was embroidering the temple curtain. And that is the same curtain which would therefore be torn in two at the moment of the crucifixion. So there's this beautiful little tradition about the life of Mary, which the artist Rossetti has become interested in, and he painted a companion picture for this one, where she is shown making this thing. So the idea of Mary as an artist became important to Dante Gabriel Rossetti, this pre-Raphaelite artist, that he wanted to show her as someone who is an artist, as well as someone who is the Mother of God. And out of this comes Edward Burne-Jones. Here is his altarpiece for St. Paul's Church in Brighton from 1861. The Adoration, so the Magi and the shepherds in the center, and then on either side, with Gabriel on the left and the Blessed Virgin Mary on the right, the Annunciation. It's a bit of a dark picture. It's got lots of sort of maroon and deep gold tones in it, so I'm not going to stick with it for long because it's quite difficult to see in detail. But one thing that I will say is that the figure of the king who is kneeling closest to Jesus is a portrait of William Morris. And the Blessed Virgin Mary is based on William Morris's wife, Jane. And so the relationships and the friendships that are constantly being shown and being re-inscribed in works of art like this one are also a really key part of this group and the way that they relate to one another through their art. When people talk about Edward Burne-Jones, a lot of the time this is what they think of. So these are absolutely classic, top of his career pictures. On the left, Laus Veneris. So this is the idea of Venus in her bedchamber being entertained by her maidens who are playing invented musical instruments and who are singing from this absolutely beautifully painted, illuminated manuscript. And I haven't got a detail to show you, so you'll just have to trust me. But music and art also became very important for Burne-Jones. He painted a number of pianos. Painted a clavichord. He was really curious about the relationship between music and art, and you can really see that coming across here as well in the right in his painting called Chant d'Amour. Oh, no, there we go. And on the left, I spoke earlier about Chaucer and King Arthur and the Bible as these incredible collections of texts which could produce all sorts of potential in art over and over again in infinite combinations and different forms. And so this, for Burne-Jones, became a really significant picture, late 1870s. And it was exhibited at the Grosvenor Gallery, which was like the height of contemporary art, fashion, fabulousness at that moment. So this was like the place to exhibit your work. And Burne-Jones's work was occasionally quite controversial. He often would say of his pictures, Phyllis and Demophoon, and also an image of the Merciful Knight, which I'll show you in a minute, that they would be kind of hidden so that people wouldn't take too close a look at them. And this picture is really about domination and subjection. Caroline Arscott as well, she's written some really interesting stuff about sadomasochistic desire and Burne-Jones. I'm sorry to tell you that's not what this lecture is about. But, maybe next time, if you invite me back, if you have that kind of a series, then I'll come and talk about sadomasochism in Victorian painting, which I gladly would, but not tonight. But what's happening here is that this is an encounter between Merlin and Nimue, and she is in the act of casting a spell on him, where he is kind of merging with and becoming lulled into this hawthorn tree. So what he wants us to see is this man's energy being drained from him right before our eyes. So something about a process which is a kind of dark and frightening and deathly process that's taking place on the canvas, frozen in a moment, and yet possible to be able to interact with emotionally. Whether or not he's successful, that's up to you, but that's where he was going. And one of the ways in which he's done that is by, and she's got snakes in her hair, by the way, so she's super creepy, is by placing her contrapposto, so she's got one leg forward and the other leg back, like a classical statue, in between us and Merlin. So if you're the kind of person who wants to rush in and rescue Merlin and restore him to his power, you can't because she's blocking your way. So there is a kind of psychological power play at work here, which he was very keen to, he hoped that people would kind of work with it in that way and to see those bodies in that way. A very different project towards the end of William Morris and Burne-Jones's lives, around the time just before the final window went in here, so 1894 to 1896. Morris died in 1896. That was the Kelmscott Press project, where they thought it would be a wonderful idea to create their own printing press and to produce beautiful books. And the most famous among them is the Kelmscott Chaucer. I like this stuff so much that seriously, this is ridiculous, that I have a tattoo on my arm, and it's a bit of T.S. Eliot. The font for this tattoo is called Golden, and it's one of the Kelmscott fonts that William Morris developed for the Kelmscott Press. So if you don't like the Kelmscott Press, that's perfectly fine, but now you know that I really do. Burne-Jones is also famous for his cartoons and for his letter writing, which was filled with illustrations of all kinds, and he has a really quirky sense of humor, which he enjoyed using as often as possible. And so here, May 1896, bless ye my children. So this is an appearance of Saint Chaucer in Bloomsbury, near the British Museum, where Morris and Burne-Jones would go to spend time with medieval manuscripts and learn whatever they could about early printed books, so that then they could go and honor the memory of Saint Chaucer in the work that they were doing. But what I love is that the way that Burne-Jones has done this drawing, neither of them looks particularly convinced about what they're doing, and they both look a little bit like disobedient schoolboys with their hands shoved deep into their pockets as they're just sort of, they've been caught doing something. So it's an image that works in a few different directions at once. It's not simple, even though it is very sweet. And on the right, this is the Seminary for More Advanced Dragon Babies. Burne-Jones did many drawings over the course of his life, particularly in correspondence with younger members of his family and with young women. And a lot of the time, they are very, very silly. And this is among the sweetest, I think. So on the left, the history school, and on the right, the geography school. And over the top, he's placed this building in the middle of this really strange mountainous kind of dinosaur dragon terrain. And clearly, these ones are the very advanced ones, and they're very serious because they have books and they have ink, but they also have somersaults, and they get sleepy, and they like to hug each other a lot. So there you go. Not everyone loves Edward Burne-Jones. Jonathan Jones doesn't like Edward Burne-Jones very much. So this is his 2-star review in The Guardian of the Edward Burne-Jones exhibition that was at Tate Britain a few years ago. And I'm just curious, how many of you saw that exhibition in London a few years ago? Most of you know? A couple of you, yes. And there's recently been a Rossetti exhibition at Tate Britain as well, focusing on Christina and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. I think a couple of you have seen that as well. The Pre-Raphaelites, they never go away. They seem to sort of come back again and again. And it's not so much that there's this special club where either you like them or you don't like them. They don't stay Marmite forever. But the thing that really stuck with me about Jonathan Jones's review is that he really believes that Burne-Jones's paintings are lifeless, that they're too affected, that they really don't have the kind of quality required in order to connect with things like where we started, around judgment and life's meaning, and whether or not it's possible to be able to connect with community deeply through art, and what the responsibility of the artist might be in that. And whether one agrees with him or not, I think it's really interesting that Jonathan Jones, or any other critic really, would look at Burne-Jones's work and see lifelessness. You are absolutely allowed to see Burne-Jones's work and think, it does nothing for me. Of course, everybody's different and people are people. I also think it's really compelling that for an artist for whom the complexity of life, the inevitability of death, the difficulty of human emotion, trying to bring these classic stories of the Bible and Arthur back to life in a way which had a dreamlike and yet a deep-rooted quality. It just misses the mark so deeply for some. And Burne-Jones tried to describe this difficulty himself in this image, and it has a title. It is the artist attempting to meet the world of art with disastrous results. So frustrated and pained at his inability to be able to paint what he wants to paint, he gets up from his seat in total anguish, and then he sits down, he looks deeply, and then he thinks, I know what to do. And of course, in entering the world of art, he destroys the canvas and ends up on the other side. But what I kind of love about this is that as he destroys the canvas and he ends up on the other side, there is a possibility of fun, playful realization that it's all art anyway. That you don't have to paint a giant canvas in order to and have it be successful or perfect in order to join the world of art. That life is in itself artful. In that way, he's quite similar to someone like William Blake, who believed that God was the great artist and that Jesus in particular had a kind of artfulness because of the reality of the incarnation. And so this kind of imagery, where we see Burne-Jones not taking himself too seriously, thankfully, also teaches us something about how very serious art really is. That the canvas itself might not be that serious, but the world of art and entering into and merging with something which is more beautiful than what we could imagine, or that takes us out of ourselves and allows us to imagine a better world where things are possible beyond what our expectations could have been, especially if we work together in community. That can be really good. That can take us somewhere really positive and really worthwhile going. And the reason why I've put it next to this picture on the right, which is part of a series, it's the Pygmalion series, is that this series really focuses on Burne-Jones's engagement with art making. So this is the moment where Pygmalion has, he's sculpted an image of Venus, and he realizes that it's just an image, it's just a cold statue, it's just rock. And that isn't what he wanted. What he wanted is a real woman, whatever that might mean, and, discuss. And what he wanted was for it to somehow be lively and come to life. And in subsequent images in this series and in the story, no less than Venus herself grants that wish and brings this rock to life, brings it into being. When Burne-Jones was working on many of his religious commissions, he thought a great deal about the relationship between life and death and the relationship between materials and innovation. And in the winter of 1885, he was thinking about a mosaic for the Tree of Life in St. Paul's, the American Anglican Church in Rome, which hopefully some of you have been to. It's a really very beautiful place. If you've had a chance to go, fantastic. And if you've not, perhaps at some point you will, because it's really something to see. And he thought about it for a while. He didn't do much with it for a while. And then in 1891, he thought about it again. And he said, someone has offered to pay for another arch in this church to be covered. I'm going to make the design I've set my heart on. It will be a great flowering tree, a mystical thing. Christ hanging with outspread arms, but not crucified. The cross, a big tree with leaves all over. The stems are gold, a great flowering tree growing all over the space, myriads of leaves, every leaf as big as a hand. And in the tree, a pale Christ. On the one side is Adam and the other Eve, and two toddlers. These stand for the whole of humankind. I believe that this says as much as anything that I have ever done. But then Burne-Jones also acknowledged and kind of amplified, everything is done to make it not a picture, and few will understand it. This is a really weird idea, that even as he's imagining what it's going to be like, how he's going to do it, he creates this is how, you're looking at this while I'm reading you this, so you can see sort of how he was working it through. And even as he was working it through, the goal is to make it not a picture. And he knows, with some sadness, few will understand it. I don't have any answers for that. But what I do know is that he was trying to push mosaic beyond mosaic. He was trying to push painting beyond painting. And I think by picture here, he's meaning something that maybe is a bit decorative in its association. He didn't want it to be just sort of pretty or nice or something where people looked at it and went, yeah, that's Jesus, tree of life, got it. He wanted it to do something bigger, something more interesting. And I think he feared that in trying to do something more interesting, he would end up doing something more confusing. And that's the line that a lot of artists walk, especially when they do commissions in churches and cathedrals, where there's a question about what we would hope to get out of it. What are we meant to see? Which I think in some ways is an unfortunate question to be asking theologically, because that sounds a bit transactional to me, where it's like, well, I'm looking at this window. What am I meant to see? What am I meant to get? I always set an alarm when I do stuff like this, or else I'll be up here all evening. So that's my 5-minute warning. In terms of what am I meant to see and what am I meant to get, this is one of the most interesting examples, I think. Burne-Jones has imagined a porphyry tomb for Christ on the morning of the resurrection. And this is a painting that was initially made as an altarpiece for St. Peter's, Vere Street in the 1880s. And it was a memorial to the Christian socialist F.D. Morris. And that theologian, who was a fascinating person, believed that the church's duty is to be the life-giving energy to every body in the midst of which she dwells. That the church is responsible for having that kind of wellspring of vitality. And so a memorial to someone who believed something like that about the church would have to say something about the nature of life itself, about what energy is or what it can do. And so then this is particularly surprising because it seems to be quite a slow, quiet, calm image. And the biblical quotation that went along with it is not the typical Mary and Jesus in the garden recognition moment. It is the moment in the Gospel of John where she does not know. So what he's painting here is an image that hovers somewhere between the not knowing and the knowing. And by giving us Christ in profile, and helping us through the composition to focus on the image of Mary Magdalene between these two angels as she grips onto this cave. What we're being given is an opportunity to look into the face of Mary Magdalene as she looks into the face of Jesus, and as she doesn't get it. Not as she does get it, but as she doesn't get it. Which is a really interesting way to interpret this scene and to work with it. And so the way that Burne-Jones explores this through these little details is also really satisfying. And I also really enjoy up-close images of paintings because you get that wonderful sense of the texture, how it was made, the weave of the canvas. And so here is the Merciful Knight. And this is a story of a knight who has an opportunity to avenge a death, and someone close to him has died. And so he's considering doing damage to someone else. And he stops, in the original story, he stops into a church, and miraculously, the wood of the cross becomes the flesh of Christ, and Christ bends down off the cross to embrace him. And Burne-Jones places this instead in a woodland, in a kind of a roadside shrine. The knight's helmet is removed, his sword thrust out into our space, his companion waiting in the background with the horse out behind the door. It's a very private image, and yet, because there's someone in the background and because we are there, it's also a strangely exposed image. It's very private, it's very vulnerable, but it's also something that kind of anyone can see from multiple spaces and multiple directions. Burne-Jones has tried hard here to depict what it might be like if wood became flesh, and you can really see that in the contrast between the body of how Christ looks and the knight's face. And this is how Burne-Jones started. So initially, there was going to be an altar, and there was going to be a kiss. And then there was no altar. And then there was kind of an altar and sort of a kiss, but he wasn't sure, and he's erasing as he goes. It's wonderful that these drawings are here as part of this process. And then in the end, what he settled on is this kind of intimate embrace, which is certainly tender, but doesn't have the same queer kind of attribute to it, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And so when Burne-Jones is thinking about a miraculous encounter with the divine, which connects us to mercy, he's thinking about it in all kinds of different ways, some of which are perhaps, to you, I don't know, if you look at this, surprising. And so I'm going to end here. This is a painting called Love Leading the Pilgrim. And it's painted as well towards the end of Burne-Jones's life. And it's an image of hope, and it's an image of contrast too, where this figure emerging from brambles is not yet in a space of freedom, not yet in a space of liberation. It was dedicated to Swinburne, the poet, and in 1895 he wrote about it and he said, "I won't be putting much color into this. The landscape needs to be a melting gray. The figures will jump out too much with full color." A couple of weeks later, he was reworking the thorns and the birds over and over again. And he said, "Damn these robins. Damn the thorns. They are much worse than the robins." He was thinking here about Roman de la Rose, about Chaucer. He'd been working with this theme since the 1870s. And ultimately, I think that one of the reasons why he found the birds so frustrating is because in their tiny detail, they had to embody so much meaning, visible and yet barely visible, about the way in which something which can feel cold and dead and broken can become a sign of life and a sign of joy, even in the same creature. They are different birds in nature, of course they are, but in this painting, it is as though they are the same kind of creature, transformed by the prospect of life and of love itself, leading the pilgrim, leading us out from one place to another. When Burne-Jones was thinking about religion, as we heard earlier, he was thinking about how religion could draw us closer to one another in community and how different expressions of religion could be across a variety of different traditions. And so for Burne-Jones, Christ can be a self-giver, a tender healer, someone who bears holy burdens, someone surrounded by red, fiery angels with musical instruments, a tiny infant born in a cave. And we have those things here in this building. And the more that I worked on this so that I could share it with you this evening, the more the words of Hannah Arendt came to mind. And so this is where I'm going to end. She says, "We are called mortals, defined by the shared reality of death. What if we were called natals, linked by the shared reality of birth?" Burne-Jones never met Hannah Arendt for obvious reasons, but I think he would have liked this idea. And so I will leave you with that. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from you with any questions or ideas. Those of you online as well, you've heard what the email address is for questions. And I'm just delighted to have been able to have been here with you this evening and shared something of Burne-Jones and his relationship to God and theology. Thank you.
helps if my microphone doesn't fall off. But anyway, that's so a great big thank you to Ayla. If anybody's got any questions, if you raise your hand, and Rose is coming around with a roving microphone. If you're watching online and you have questions at birminghamcathedral.com, and Harriet's going to write them down and bring them up to the front. I've got a question to start, if that's okay. So one of the things I've been reflecting on is, as Birmingham Cathedral, we're seeking to live out our vocation as an urban cathedral. And we're also seeking to be the cathedral for Birmingham, as it is in the 21st century. And one of the things that struck me looking at all those very beautiful images that we've been seeing there, or as I gaze at the windows in this cathedral, is that so much of what's in the Morris and the Pre-Raphaelite art is kind of looking back to medieval times, and also a very rural medieval sort of way of life. Thinking about the Last Judgment window, the middle section is a very dark, ruined cityscape, and whether that was 19th century Birmingham or Renaissance Italy with the shapes, we don't know. But it's almost very much a sort of judgment on the urban, and how do we use that tradition in ways which make sense in Birmingham now?
Wow. Okay.
Sorry, that's a thesis, really.
So, no, I like it. Yeah. So, first of all, with this layer of architectural fragments, and if you're familiar with the window, you'll know what we mean. If not, there is an image of it at the back, and you can go and take a look at it a little bit later on. That it's as though someone took a series of images of buildings and then scrunched them up and pushed them together and sort of shook them around a little bit. And I'm curious about what that might do as a metaphor. It would be quite fun to take something like just that layer and consider how it works with a sort of, it's our sort of ceiling or something like that between heaven and earth, right? And to think, okay, so if that's your layer there, what aspect of your city would you put in that layer? What would you want to see featured? Or what would you want to see destroyed? Or what needs to be taken and then shaken up and put back together in a different kind of kaleidoscopic pattern? Are there certain aspects of the city that we hope will somehow be embedded within the New Jerusalem, that we will recognize in one way or another as being transformed and redeemed, and yet so beautifully and wonderfully themselves? Are there aspects of the city that we cannot wait to see utterly destroyed? And why might that be? And so I would potentially do something like that, where you use what you've got, and then you think, now what can we make?
Thank you. Any questions from anyone? One at the front.
Hello.
Hi.
Firstly, thank you for such an interesting talk. Higher? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for such an interesting talk. It was really lovely to see this in the context of this beautiful church. I'm interested in the way we're framing his work with theology, when in fact the Pre-Raphaelites were known for a very secular life. And particularly his relationship with William Morris was not one of great, religious thinking and discussions. How do we marry that? Because I always find it quite confusing that some of the most inspirational theological artists have such often questionable lives, but that we sort of relate them to religion in some strange, dynamic way. I had to ask. There may not be an answer.
Thank you. Yeah, these are great questions. That's really important. There are a couple of different things in there, so let's see if I can get them organized in my mind. So yes, as far as the Pre-Raphaelites are concerned, each of them has quite a different approach to and relationship to religion. So William Holman Hunt has a pretty significant conversion experience and is an evangelical Christian. He goes off to Israel-Palestine in 1854. Prior to that, he's painting religious scenes like the light of the world, and he's thinking very carefully about how art can communicate as a sort of an evangelizing thing. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, his family are Italian Roman Catholic, and his sister Christina Rossetti was a very strong, devout Anglo-Catholic. Their sister Maria was an Anglican nun as part of an Anglo-Catholic community. Dante Gabriel Rossetti himself, not that fussed about it particularly, but also knows so much about the culture of it and wants to be able to work with it in a way that could suit a church or someone's drawing room or a little book project that he might give to his friend. John Everett Millay, not especially religious, but he, together with a number of others, is doing things like the Dalziel Bible illustrations and all of that. William Morris, articulately secular, for sure, absolutely, and wants so much to be able to, like a number of others in that group, Burne-Jones included, to ask very deep questions about how the church as an institution, as well as its theological beliefs and expectations, may or may not be fit for purpose in all circumstances. They're very happy to be able to look at it critically and to not be especially Christian in the way that they do stuff. I'm trying to remember whose funeral it was. It might have been Frederick Lord Leighton's funeral, but if my colleagues are out there, you know, and they stumble across this one day on the internet and they're like, no, it wasn't him. But anyway, one of these really famous Victorian art giants dies in the mid-1890s. And one of their dear friends goes and they look around at the funeral, and one of them is shocked because they're like, oh my God, he's singing a hymn. He never sings hymns. He must really miss his artist best friend. That's amazing. So yeah, there's a huge range. And it's the case with many artists that, and I'm thinking of like Le Corbusier and Ronchamp, for example, and things like that, you know, these beautiful works of art in Roman Catholic contexts in France in the mid-20th century, Matisse, many examples, where artists themselves may not be going to church every day and they may not have deep relationships to religion that can be conventionally explained or that sort of run in a framework that might be recognizable, and yet they make absolutely beautiful Christian art within and beyond church and cathedral contexts. That's great. And there are absolutely, and I heard what you were saying as well about people whose, artists whose lives are, you know, potentially absolutely deplorable. The decisions that they might make or the ways that they might live would be chaotic or absolutely abhorrent. And yet, they make art. And they make art which appears to be very beautiful, or which might seem to be very profound, or to come from a place of love, or to touch a place of love in the viewers. And people are complicated. And these are exactly the kinds of histories that we need to reckon with all the time. That's a part of the wider question that we need to face always about contested heritage and what we do.
Any more questions? Yeah. So if we have the one in the cathedral, and I'll go and get Harriet's, which has been submitted online.
Okay, cool.
You mentioned androgyny. Could you tell us a little bit more about why androgyny was so important to Burne-Jones?
Oh, wow, I love that. Why was androgyny important to Burne-Jones? Yeah. I wish I knew, I wish I had one answer where I'm like, androgyny was important to Burne-Jones because in this letter in 1872, he said that androgynous faces look better, or something. We don't know. I think, and for a lot of the angels, actually, the model for the angels is his daughter, Margaret. And so there's that too. And he uses models in all sorts of different ways. And thinking about William Holman Hunt and The Light of the World, again, he uses Christina Rossetti as one of the models for Jesus in that painting. So there's a blending together of faces, figures, genders, all the time. And my sense with Burne-Jones is that what he's trying to get at is a kind of a languidity, which is also pretty just generally popular at the time. There's something called the aesthetic movement, which really gets rolling from the 1860s onwards, and which is connected to the art for art's sake movement, which some of you may have heard of, where there's an idea of a sort of quality of beauty which is dreamlike, has a sort of fantastical, almost escapist kind of bohemian quality to it. And that seems to go along with a number of artists exploring androgyny in their work. And Burne-Jones is part of that. I think that when it comes to angels, it's just good theology, because angels are neither male nor female. And so there's an androgynous quality that he's just simply aware of and then working through in his art in a very particular way. But he does not just do it with angels. And so what I kind of am curious about with Burne-Jones is that there's a sort of type of humanity that he's working with aesthetically that means that with just about any of his figures, there are a surprising number of open questions about who they are, how they're feeling, what they're doing. Very little is taken for granted, and that androgyny seems to be part of that, where you think, what kind of person is that? Who are they? What are they feeling? What are they thinking? I'd be curious to know what your experience is of looking at the faces in the windows really up close, because there's, a real articulate androgynousness in these windows, if you like. What do you think?
There's one which we've been reflecting on quite a lot, which is in the Ascension window. It's one of the angels on the left, and that was the face that was most damaged. So he or she, and you can't tell, has got a crack across, and before the piece has just gone back in, so it's been cleaned, but before it was cleaned, there was a mixture of oil and pigeon muck on it, which made it look like the angel was crying and scarred. And I think that the reflection on that was actually around to do with healing, really, and thinking about trauma, that even in heaven we keep our scars. So we know that one of the ways Jesus was recognised in the resurrection was through his scars, or thinking about British Sign Language, a sign for Jesus is pointing at scars in his hands. That's been cleaned up now by the restorers, so the muck has gone. The crack is still there, invisible, because they don't want to do anything that's not kind of reversible. So I think it's something in all that about actually how heaven and earth now kind of fit closely together, and thinking about where our society is now, where all those thorny questions for the Church of England on human sexuality are now, and what those windows perhaps might be able to show us or teach us or help us to think or ask some difficult questions of us.
Wow, that's interesting. Thank you for your question. What else have we got?
There was a question online which was around what Burne-Jones's sexuality might have been, and I suppose a follow-up question is thinking about that, about does it matter?
Yeah, great. So Burne-Jones was married to a woman, Georgiana. He had a family. He had children, and he had a very famous affair with a woman called Maria Zambacco, who he painted as a model in a number of his pictures. I am not a Burne-Jones biographical scholar to the extent that I'm like, but those are the main stories. As far as I'm aware, he was a cisgendered straight guy, as far as I know. But that might not be the whole story, and that's cool. But yeah, I don't know. And I like the, and does it matter? And I think, on the one hand, it matters because everyone's life is precious and because everyone's expression of who they truly are and then how those desires and those experiences manifest themselves in the world and as artists, therefore, in their art in one way or another, it matters because our lives matter, our desires matter. In another way, it absolutely does not matter because what he made is what he made. And being able to hold both of those things together is possibly a useful way of exploring the kind of work that he made and thinking to oneself, what does this mean to me? At the same time, I'm aware that in my own life, when I work with or when I get to know art by queer people, I am delighted by their work because I think as a queer person myself, I can see something perhaps of that kind of affinity in their work, whether or not their work has anything to do with that in particular, that it simply came from the work of someone who experiences life in a way that I have an affinity with. It makes a difference. So does it matter? Yes and no. And was he straight? Probably, I think so.
Thank you. Question just here. So thanks, Rose.
Thank you. This is a quick observation rather than a question, but I think one of the interesting points about the light of the world is that on the door there's no handle or lock.
That's right.
on the outside.
Yeah.
We have to let Jesus into our lives. He can't force his way in.
Yes, so the light of the world with that door connects to, I'm sure you know this too, that there is an inscription that goes along with that painting, and it's, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." And so there's an invitation, but the door in that painting is also really overgrown with dead brambles and weeds that have got carried away. So it's a painting that is, it's a painting that's asking an open question. And the question that it's asking is, will you open the door today? But no one has to. It's interesting, right? Because it's not about being forced to do anything. And that makes me think about Burne-Jones a little bit, because a lot of the unreadability of the faces of people's emotions, their expressions, or the openness that they seem to have to being interpreted in a variety of ways suggests in some ways that he's not forcing interpretation in a way that some of the other pre-Raphaelites kind of do. But I'd not really thought about it that way before. Thank you. Pardon me, sorry.
Any more questions? Question from Andrew. Yep.
I think thank you for a wonderful talk. It was really brilliant. Thank you so much. I think it's really interesting that it's connected to what the lady there at the front was asking at the beginning, I think. But it's really interesting that quite secular artists in this period are still very, very interested and fascinated by the way that human feeling more broadly can be examined through religious themes and religious media. I guess that's partly just because the society they're from and they live in is still much more religiously literate and religiously conversant. But they're very interested in the way that much more general and human feeling can be explored. And that's sort of been lost, hasn't it, in our society. But just the way that religion can still be so interesting to the secular world, even if you don't believe in God, there's still a lot of human stuff in there that is really useful and fascinating and helpful. And then again, the way that there were secular thinkers who were fascinated by Newman. You mentioned Newman at the beginning. Newman's a very religious figure. You know, and one feels that although he's got a lot to say, he could have a lot to say to people now, but it would be very difficult to sort of explain to them how, I think.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on how artists pick things up and run with them. So I went to an exhibition recently by the artist Chris Ofili, And it's a new range of work based around the idea of the 7 deadly sins. And it is a remarkable body of work. And it is, so colorful and so luminous, and the ideas are just bursting out all over the place. And I thought, what an interesting thing that he figures, and he's been working with ideas around Christianity and theology in his work for a long time, but that he figures that he's going to make this big thing and call it that, and people will do something with it and get something out of it. And it relies, to an extent, on a kind of literacy still being present. And I think sometimes, and like having worked at the National Gallery for a while, at the Courtauld as well, which has this incredible collection of Western art, much of which comes from religious contexts, that sometimes I would go and I would spend time with groups of people, different ages, different cultural backgrounds, and I would think, I've really got to give this group in front of me an enormous amount of credit, because they're seeing things, they're picking things up. They are not churchgoers, they might not be Christian, but they're really getting quite quickly into what's happening there in that altarpiece or whatever it is and why it might be happening. And then sometimes I would spend time with groups and I would think, you've got no idea what this is about. No idea what this is about. But either way, in a sense, a bit like that question around sexuality, it doesn't matter, because the picture itself, the work of art itself, is speaking fresh every time. And artists do, I think, I'm thinking about the summer exhibition that's been up this year at the Royal Academy. Artists, just like the rest of us, are still swimming in this soup in which Christianity is still present, even though people don't go to church much. And so it's still there, but there in a way which is rather different from the 1870s, where I think probably the toolkit for, like if they were playing with a 1,000-piece Lego set in terms of what they could imagine their audiences could get and construct for themselves based on what they knew about the Bible from Sunday school or whatever it was, we're probably playing with around a 100-piece Lego set, but we're still playing with Lego.
And I think one of the things which places like this are, and galleries and so on, are grappling with and working on very hard is how we interpret sacred art to people who might not have that toolkit. Yes. I think the thing we're enormously lucky with the Burne-Jones windows in this building is that they're of the quality where people have emotional response to them, which you can then work on. And please come back and see them once the scaffolding's down, because quite how bright and beautiful they'll be.
Amazing.
After cleaning. Shall we stop and say thank you to Ayla?
No, thank you very much.
There's a very small token of our appreciation there. Thank you for being with us and sharing so much, and helping us really to really sort of press on with our knowledge and our thinking and our reflecting on these windows. So thank you, Ayla.
Well, thank you for having me. It's just a pleasure to be here, and thank you all so much for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So keep in touch with us. We do things like this periodically. If you're not on our mailing list, ask and you will get on it, so you'll get information about things. But thank you very much, everybody.